Okay, so you know how some countries have like these really turbulent relationships?
Oh, yeah.
It's like they just can't seem to get along.
Right.
Well, Russia and the West are kind of like that.
Definitely a complicated relationship.
Yeah, it's been a diplomatic roller coaster for centuries.
Yeah, and all that history, it shaped the global landscape.
Exactly. And to really understand where things stand today, we need to like go deeper.
Absolutely.
So we're going to unpack this book by Angela Stent,
Putin's World.
Putin's World.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's a leading expert on U.S.-Russia relations.
She really gets into how the Kremlin views the world.
Exactly. It's not just about Putin, though.
Right. It's about understanding Russia itself.
Yeah, like its history, its culture.
All the factors that shape its foreign policy.
It's like solving a mystery. You need the backstory.
Exactly. You got to understand the motives.
The long-held beliefs that drive the characters.
And one of the biggest factors is geography.
Oh, yeah. Russia's massive.
The largest country in the world.
Seriously.
11 time zones. And it borders 14 countries.
That's a lot to keep track of.
It is historically that vastness has meant
Go on.
they need a strong central government.
Makes sense?
Sometimes even what they call Russification
Russification.
to maintain control over diverse ethnic groups.
Like keeping everyone on the same page.
Exactly.
So kind of like keeping up with the Romanovs back in the day.
In a way, yeah, Catherine the Great is a prime example.
She was an interesting figure.
She wasn't even Russian by birth.
Right, she was German.
A German princess who became empress.
Talk about navigating a complex system.
She understood the need for control.
For security.
And that's been a consistent theme in Russian history.
It's how they approach their neighbors and the West. Speaking of the West, it's a complicated relationship.
It really is.
Russia's always asking itself, are we European or something else?
Yeah, that whole debate about Russia's identity.
It's Eurasian destiny, as some call it.
It creates a lot of tension.
It's like they're caught between two worlds.
Never fully fitting in either one.
It reminds me of that line by Fyodor Tyutchev.
Oh yeah, the 19th century poet.
He said, with the mind alone, Russia cannot be understood. In Russia, one can only believe.
It really captures that sense of mystery.
The otherness that the West sees in Russia. Okay, so we've got this huge country
Right.
with a history of strong leaders and this ongoing identity crisis.
Yeah.
How does that play out in their relationships with other countries?
Well, let's start with Germany.
Germany, okay.
They have a long and complicated history.
Yeah, periods of cooperation and conflict.
Allies, enemies, everything in between.
It seems like it's constantly shifting,
It is, and their economies are really intertwined.
especially with energy.
Germany relies on Russian gas.
And Russia benefits from German investment. So they're frenemies.
You could say that after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Things seem to be going well.
Germany was a big supporter of Russia's transition to a market economy.
But then 2014 happened.
The annexation of Crimea.
That was a major turning point.
It led to sanctions, a loss of trust.
A real setback.
It really was.
Okay, let's talk about China now.
All right.
On the surface, Russia and China seem like a good match.
They're both skeptical of Western democracy promotion.
And they both want a multipolar world.
Some have called them a duo of the willing.
But it wasn't always smooth sailing, was it?
No, not at all. Remember that quote about taking a bath in a toilet?
Oh, yeah. That's not exactly a compliment.
That's how the Chinese communists felt about Soviet interference back in the day.
So there's a history of mistrust there, too,
There is, but now they've found common ground.
based on their shared skepticism of the West.
Right, and their desire for a different world order.
One where they have more influence.
It's strategic more than a true friendship.
Okay, let's move on to the big one.
Russia and the U.S.
This is the relationship that's probably on everyone's mind.
It's been a roller coaster.
We've seen cooperation after 9/11.
But also tension over NATO expansion, the war in Ukraine, election interference.
George W. Bush talked about looking into Putin's eyes, getting a sense of his soul.
And then things went downhill pretty fast.
Yeah, that early optimism, it didn't last.
The U.S. and Russia, they keep getting stuck in this cycle.
Hope and disappointment.
With mistrust always simmering beneath the surface.
It's like they can't escape the Cold War.
That legacy, it continues to shape their interactions.
Even decades later.
It does.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much to unpack.
Definitely.
We've only just begun to scratch the surface of this complex relationship.
We'll go deeper after the break.
So, we've talked about Russia's past, their unique perspective.
And that identity question.
Yeah, like where do they fit in?
It all feeds into their most difficult relationship.
NATO.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's not exactly a love story.
Not at all.
From what I understand, Russia sees NATO expansion as a threat.
A direct threat. It goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Things were pretty chaotic back then.
There are all these discussions about NATO's future.
Like what should happen to it?
Some said dissolve it. Others wanted a new security structure that included Russia.
That sounds like a missed opportunity.
It does, but instead NATO expanded eastward.
Taking in former Warsaw Pact countries.
Even former Soviet republics like the Baltic states.
Wow, that's got to sting if you're Russia.
It feels like a betrayal.
It's like watching your ex move on with all your friends.
And that feeling was made worse by the 2008 NATO summit.
What happened there?
The Bush administration pushed for Ukraine and Georgia to join.
Those aren't just any countries, though.
No, they were part of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union.
They're in what Russia considers its sphere of influence.
Exactly. For Putin, NATO expanding there was crossing a red line.
And then we saw the consequences.
The war with Georgia in 2008.
The annexation of Crimea in 2014.
And the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
There's a lot of turmoil.
It is. From Putin's perspective, NATO expansion is aggressive.
It's like they're trying to contain Russia.
That's how he sees it.
Okay, so NATO expansion created friction. What about the countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union?
The near abroad, as they call it.
Right. What's going on there?
Well, it's another case of history and geography colliding.
How so?
For Russia, these countries are more than just neighbors.
They see them as vital to their security.
And their influence, it's like a family that had a bad divorce.
But they still can't quite let go.
Yeah, it's tough to adjust to those power shifts.
The breakup of the Soviet Union was a huge change.
It was traumatic for Russia. They lost territory, population, prestige.
It all happened so fast.
It did, and it created new challenges.
Like what?
Millions of ethnic Russians were suddenly living outside Russia's borders.
So there's this sense of responsibility for them?
Definitely Russia feels obligated to protect them.
Even if it means getting involved in their neighbors' affairs.
It's led to some difficult situations.
Like Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia.
And, of course, Ukraine.
So many flashpoints.
Each conflict is different, but they share a common thread.
Russia using its power to maintain control. Let's take Transnistria, for example.
Okay.
Russia intervened militarily back in 1992.
To support separatists who wanted to break away from Moldova.
And they're still there.
They've kept a military presence despite pressure to withdraw.
It's like a frozen conflict.
A reminder of Russia's reach.
And then there's the war with Georgia in 2008.
Georgia tried to regain control of South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
2 breakaway regions.
Right, and Russia responded quickly.
They recognized those regions as independent.
Not many other countries followed suit.
But it was a clear message.
Russia was willing to use force.
To protect its interests.
Absolutely.
And then there's Ukraine.
The most complex case of all.
What makes Ukraine so different?
Well, Russia sees it as the birthplace of their civilization.
Their cultural heartland.
For Putin, the idea of Ukraine aligning with the West.
That's unacceptable.
It's a nightmare scenario.
So when the pro-Russian president was ousted in 2014,
After those protests,
Putin saw it as a direct threat.
he annexed Crimea.
He said it was to protect the Russian speakers there.
And to reclaim historically Russian territory.
And that's when the conflict in eastern Ukraine began.
With Russia backing the separatists.
It's a tragedy for everyone involved.
It is, and it's really damaged relations between Russia and the West.
The U.S. and its allies imposed sanctions.
The diplomatic climate is very cold.
So where does this leave Russia and its relationship with the world?
That's the big question. We've seen how geography, history, cultural identity all shape Russia's outlook.
And their actions.
But to really understand Russia's place today, we need to look at something else.
What's that?
The legacy of the Soviet Union.
We've been talking about Russia's relationships.
With the West Germany, China.
Neighbors.
Right.
And now we're getting to the legacy of the Soviet Union.
It's been decades since it collapsed.
But it still feels relevant.
It does. The Soviet Union's demise, it left a void.
Like a hole in their identity.
Exactly. Russia went from superpower to grappling with a new reality.
It's like a sudden demotion.
You could say that.
You're not sure where you belong anymore.
And for many in Russia's elite,
The collapse.
it was a humiliation.
So they want to restore Russia's greatness.
They want to be a global force again.
And that's where Putin comes in.
He wants Russia to be seen as an equal to the U.S. and China.
Not a fading power.
Exactly. And he's willing to use force to achieve that.
We've seen it in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria.
He's projecting military strength.
Defending what he sees as Russia's interests.
And he's using other tools, too.
Like energy diplomacy.
Information warfare.
So we've talked about Russia's perspective.
Right.
But is there another way to understand their actions?
Well, there's this interplay between geography and history.
Go.
Russia's a vast land power,
With few natural borders.
and that makes them feel vulnerable.
Vulnerable to invasion.
So they've developed a culture of defensiveness.
And suspicion of the outside world.
Yeah.
So that insecurity feeds into their anxieties about NATO.
Absolutely. They see NATO as a threat,
Encroaching on their territory.
challenging their sphere of influence.
But it's not just about security.
No.
There's a national identity element, too.
Russia sees itself as unique.
Separate from the West.
This exceptionalism, it influences their foreign policy.
They want their own path.
They do.
So it's history, geography, national pride, all mixed together.
Shaping how Russia sees its place in the world.
That's why they're so assertive with their neighbors.
And why they won't compromise on what they see as their core interests.
Those countries are essential to their security.
And their identity.
So where does all this leave Russia's relationship with the world?
It's definitely strained right now.
There's a lot of mistrust on both sides.
The conflict in Ukraine is a major problem.
Could we be heading for another Cold War?
It's a real concern.
Is there any hope for things to improve?
It would take a lot of effort.
For both sides.
They need to understand each other's perspectives.
Acknowledge past grievances.
And find common ground.
That sounds tough.
It is. But dialogue and diplomacy are essential.
Even with adversaries.
Ignoring Russia's concerns won't make them go away.
We need engagement.
A commitment to finding solutions.
If we want a more stable future.
Exactly.
Well, we've really gone deep into Russian foreign policy.
We've explored the history, the culture, the strategy.
It's a complex topic.
It is.
But hopefully you have a better understanding of Russia now.
How they see themselves and the world.
And why they act the way they do.
That's the goal.
What are your thoughts on Russia's role in the world today?
It's a big question.
Leave a comment below and let us know what you think.
We'd love to hear your perspective.
And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating topics.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.